The mist that lay over Nettlecombe in late October did not lift so much as thin, gradually, grudgingly, the way old debts recede without ever truly disappearing. By the time the rooks had begun their morning argument in the bare elms along the lane, the sky above the west face of the house had settled into a shade of pewter that promised neither sun nor rain, only the long, grey continuance of the season. The ivy on the stone had grown so dense over the years that even now, stripped to its dark skeleton, it covered the cracks in the masonry, the way the family had always managed its affairs. A persistent appearance of substance laid over a foundation quietly giving way. Eulalia Lindale was already in the kitchen when the rooks started their quarrelling. She had not slept well. She rarely did in October, when the household accounts became a conversation she could not avoid, and the answers they gave were always the same. The kitchen was cold at that hour, the banked fire still grey, the flagstones holding the night's chill against the soles of her boots, and she stood at the deal table in the pre-dawn light, counting tallow candles by the glow of a single stub, moving each one from the box to the shelf with the precise, unhurried deliberateness of someone who knows the exact weight of what she is counting. 19. The same number she had hoped for, and fewer than she needed. On the table beside the candle box sat the teapot. It was the last surviving piece of the porcelain service her mother had brought to Nettlecombe when she married. A delicate thing, once, pale white with a wreath of painted violets that had worn so thin with use the blossoms had become mere suggestions of themselves, shadows of colour in the glaze. The spout had been mended twice. The first repair with a careful application of gold lacquer, a practice Eulalia had read of in a volume sent by a cousin from London, and that mend had held for 4 years. The second was beginning to crack again along the seam, a fine dark line spreading through the gold. She turned the pot in her hands and assessed the damage the way she assessed everything in this house. Not for what it had been, but for what use remained in it. It could still hold tea. That would have to be enough for now. She heard her father's step on the passage. It was a sound she knew as well as her own breathing. Slow and faintly uneven since the gout had returned last spring, heavier on the right side. Mr. Lindale appeared in the kitchen doorway in his dressing gown, holding a letter with the exaggerated care of a man carrying something he knows is either a reprieve or a sentence, and has not yet decided which. "There is a reply," he said, by way of greeting. Eulalia set the teapot down carefully. "From Mr. Pendreath. He will dine on Thursday." Her father came further into the kitchen, a room he did not ordinarily visit, a room that belonged to the practical business of the house, which he preferred to leave in other hands. The fact that he had come here himself, at this hour, rather than waiting in his study for the news to find him, told her everything she needed to know about the current temperature of his hope. He turned the letter over in his fingers. He writes cordially. 2 sentences, but cordial. She poured water into the pot from the kettle she had set to warm, watching the first thin thread of steam rise into the cold kitchen air, and said nothing for a moment. She had learned, across a long education in disappointment, that hope and ruin wore the same face in her father's expression, distinguished from each other only by time and the particular object hope had most recently attached itself to. The silver service had gone to hope, piece by piece, over 2 years. The best mare had followed it. Now hope had taken the shape of a man named Pendreath, a connection, her father said, of her late mother's family, though the connection was distant enough that Eulalia had not been able to trace it clearly in the letters she had read. The introduction had come through a solicitor who had made contact in the precise, careful way solicitors do when they are conducting an inspection without wishing it to appear as one. She had read the solicitor's correspondence. She had noted the quality of the paper, the phrasing around the word arrangement, the way nothing definite was promised, while the possibility of something definite was unmistakably extended. Money, she had thought. Considerable money. and some purpose behind the visit that the solicitor had not been authorised to name. "He will want the dining parlour aired," she said, "and we will need the last of the decent wine. All of it." Yes, yes. Mr. Lindale folded the letter with the relief of a man who has just remembered that someone else will manage the difficulty. He left, still in his dressing gown, restored to his preferred state of comfortable vagueness, and his footsteps faded back toward the study and the earlier hour he had, in effect, never quite left. Jenny arrived at 6:30, quick-footed and pink-cheeked from the cold of the lane, stamping mud from her boots at the back door with efficient energy. She was 15, thin as a reed in her grey wool dress, with a sharp and clever face that might, in other circumstances, have belonged to a girl with considerably better prospects. Her mother had been a laundress at the Hall until the fever took her 2 winters past, leaving Jenny a clean name, a capacity for hard work, and nothing material to speak of. Eulalia had taken her on at a reduced wage, with the unspoken understanding, clear to both of them, that she would teach the girl her letters. This she had done, Sunday afternoons with an old primer and a patience that had surprised them both by becoming genuine interest. Jenny repaid the arrangement with a loyalty that was not the performed kind, not the kind that watches to see who is observing it. She simply did the work. "The dining parlour first," Eulalia said, as Jenny hung her cloak on the peg by the door. "The drapes beaten and rehung. The 2 silver candlesticks from the sideboard, the real ones, not the plated pair. Count what remains of the port wine and tell me honestly." Jenny was already tying her apron. "How grand must it appear, ma'am?" A fair question, precisely put. "Grand enough to suggest we are not in difficulty," Eulalia said. "Not so grand that it suggests we are trying to conceal how much difficulty we are in." The 3 days before the dinner passed in the quiet mathematics of hospitality, staged on a diminished budget. Eulalia ordered mutton. It was the only thing the household could reasonably afford in a quantity suitable for guests, and committed herself to managing it. She made lists. She sent Jenny to the apothecary's garden 2 lanes over for rosemary and thyme, traded a jar of last summer's quince preserve for them, and considered the exchange reasonable. On the morning of the dinner, the kitchen fire refused to draw. The flue had been unreliable since September, and this morning it was actively obstructive, filling the kitchen with a low, grey haze that made Jenny's eyes stream and turned the air sharp with the smell of wet ash and scorched iron. Eulalia stood over the pot with a patience that had very little calm in it, adjusting the damper, opening the back door to coax a draught, adding the rosemary in 2 stages and the thyme all at once, and finally, as a last diplomatic measure, a spoonful of the mustard she had been storing since August. Whether the dish would be what it was meant to be, she would not know until it reached the table, and it was already too late to alter anything. This was a condition she had learned, across the years, to work within. She heard the carriage on the drive at 1/4 the hour, later than expected, and understood that introductions had already been made without her. She washed her hands at the basin, smoothed the front of her skirts, the good grey wool, which was the best she owned and was doing its best, and walked to the dining parlour at an unhurried pace. If the evening was going to be endured, it would be endured with composure, which required a composure of step. The man already seated at her father's table was not what she had constructed from the solicitor's letter. She had imagined someone older, florid, comfortable in the way of wealth carried for many years. Perhaps a little impatient with small establishments, but not unkindly so. This man was perhaps 35. Dark hair worn without any studied arrangement, a long jaw, a quality of stillness in the way he held himself that suggested a body accustomed to discipline rather than ease. His amber eyes caught the candlelight and held it without warmth. The way certain minerals catch light, reflecting it back rather than being changed by it. His coat was so deliberately plain that its plainness became, by the sheer force of its contrast with the room, a statement. I have no need to indicate what I am, because what I am requires no indication. He glanced at her when she entered, absorbed her presence in a single unhurried appraisal, and returned his attention to her father with the expression of a man whose interest in the current conversation had already been spent some time ago. Her father was at his most hopeful, speaking of her mother's family, the shared history, the connections that seemed, in his telling, to reach back like roots beneath the two houses and join them underground. Mr. Pendreath, she had only that name then, not knowing yet there was a title attached to it, listened with a courtesy so carefully maintained it was almost a form of labour. He offered a question here, a brief word there. In the manner of a man discharging a social obligation he has measured in advance and intends to complete within its allotted time. He was not cruel. He was something more wearing than cruelty. He was methodical about his disengagement. Every sentence he offered her father was a sentence technically adequate, technically polite, technically attentive, and entirely without genuine presence behind it. The mutton arrived. Jenny served it with a steadiness Eulalia noted and filed away. The disguise held, mostly. The rosemary had done its work. The conversation moved to land, to rents, to the difficulties of the autumn season, safe, thin, impersonal ground. It was the bread that changed the evening. She had been watching him throughout the meal with the quiet attention she applied to anything that required understanding, cataloguing the small, impersonal discourtesies of a man with power who had long since stopped noticing he was committing them. The slight displacement of attention when her father spoke, the way he offered sentences in response the way one offers food to a dog, not unkindly, without expectation of preference. She had seen it before, in county families who came to call in the years after the money began to go, who were too well-bred for cruelty and too comfortable to imagine that discomfort was something that could happen to them, by way of imposition rather than accident. She reached for the bread and, without preamble, spoke. "You are very bored," she said, in a tone she might have used to note the weather. The table went still in the way that rooms go still when something that has been true for some time is abruptly named aloud. Her father's hand stopped moving. Beside the half-open door, the shadow of Jenny's apron did not stir. The amber eyes moved to her face. "I beg your pardon," he said. Not quite a question. "I am not misreading you," she said. "You have been courteous throughout the evening, which does you credit. But boredom, when it is directed at a person, is its own form of discourtesy, however quietly it is administered. It seemed worth naming, since you have managed to avoid naming it yourself." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be a thing in itself. Not empty, but weighted, pressing gently on all four walls of the room. He looked at her, not the swift, assessing glance of a man cataloguing a woman, but something with more time in it, more care. As though he had encountered a text he had expected to be brief and was discovering it was not. "No one," he said at last, slowly and with a quality of genuine discovery in it, "has ever said that to me." "I would imagine not," she replied, and passed him the bread. What followed was something she would turn over in her mind many times afterward. The way she turned the teapot, testing the repair, checking what held. He set down his fork, and for the first time since he had arrived, he was entirely present in the room. He turned the conversation to the question of drainage along the lower field of the Lindale land, a subject he had clearly had researched, or had caused to be researched on his behalf before he came. And he spoke to her father about it, with an attention that was plainly not constructed for the occasion. He asked genuine questions. He waited for the answers. Her father, who had not been genuinely listened to in a very long time, straightened in his chair, recovered his colour, and spoke for 20 minutes about a subject he knew well and had nearly forgotten he knew. By the time the port was poured, there was something in her father's eyes that was not the fragile, leaning quality of hope, but the more upright quality of a man who has been treated as if his knowledge had value. After the port, Pendreath rose to leave. At the door, he spoke to her father and shook his hand with the economy of gesture that characterized everything he did. And then, at the last, he turned and asked her father her name again, though she had been introduced at the beginning of the evening, which meant he had heard it already and was asking a second time for a reason she could not yet read. Her father told her afterward, when the carriage had gone and the house had settled back to its ordinary quiet, who their guest had been. The Duke of Pendreath. One of the great landholders of the south of England, her father said, which was why the solicitor had written rather than the man himself, and why the letter had been on paper of that quality. He had said something at the door, the Duke. He had said it quietly, so that only her father heard it clearly. That her daughter was the only person who had spoken the truth to him in 11 years. Her father wept a little. She sat with him until the wine had worn off and the hope had gentled itself into sleep, and then she went back to the kitchen. The fire had burnt down to a low red glow. The smoke was long gone, the air clean again. She found the teapot on the table where she had left it that morning. She lifted it, both hands around the body of it, feeling the place where the crack ran beneath her thumb, and stood there in the dark kitchen while the last warmth the clay had held all day passed slowly into her palms. She did not know yet what a man asks for when he asks a woman's name for the second time at a door. She did not know whether 11 years without a truthful word was a wound that could be reached, or one that had gone past reaching. She did not know what shape a life might take around the answer to either question. Outside, the rooks had gone silent in the elms. The mist was already beginning to build again in the low fields, rising steadily in the dark, patient as a tide, preparing the valley for the next grey morning, the way it had prepared all the mornings before, each one arriving with its careful candle and its repaired things and its particular arithmetic of what could be kept. What she did not know, standing there in the kitchen, the small warmth of the pot leaving her hands as it left, was whether this one was going to be different. Winter came to the North Counties first, as it always did, descending with a quiet authority that left no room for negotiation. The Duke of Pendreath rode through it on the 2nd day of November, with his collar turned against a wind that had come all the way from the sea, grey and salt-edged, carrying nothing in it that resembled comfort. He had 4 hours of poor road before High Hall, and he spent most of them in the peculiar stillness of a man who has been occupied with a thought he cannot adequately account for, and has given up trying to dismiss it by giving it his full attention instead. He had her name. He had asked for it twice, once at the introduction, once at the door. Eulalia. An old-fashioned name, formal in the mouth, not the kind of name that belonged to the season of pale muslin and easy smiles that London currently preferred. It suited her in the way certain objects suit themselves, without apology, without having been arranged to suit anything. The road worsened past Manton, and he focused on it, but there was a quality to the impression she left in his mind that was different from the ordinary trace a person makes on a person. It did not flatten with distance the way faces do. It had, in fact, more clarity now than it had possessed across the table. The particular steadiness of her voice when she named what she had seen. The brief pause before she spoke, which was not hesitation, but choice. The way she had passed him the bread afterward, with no trace of performance in the gesture, as though she had said a true thing and intended to continue eating dinner, which was, he supposed, precisely what she had done. He arrived at High Hall after dark. The house received him in the way it always did, capable, immaculate, correct, and entirely empty of any quality that could reasonably be described as warmth. His steward, Mr. Grange, met him in the front hall with the deference of a man who has served a house well for many years and has transferred his loyalty entirely from the family to the institution. There were papers. There were always papers. The mill question on the Western estate had been waiting since September, and Grange had brought the summary in a folio tied with dark ribbon, which he offered with the expression of a man presenting a gift he knows to be unwelcome. "Tomorrow morning," the Duke said, and handed over his coat. He went to the study. It was the room he lived in when he was at High Hall. The library was grander and better lit. But the library contained Edmund's books, arranged as Edmund had arranged them, which was a situation the Duke had decided 5 years ago he was not prepared to disturb. The study had a smaller fire, a worse chair, and no portraits. He preferred it. He sat down with the steward's folio and opened it. The mill, a question of water rights, access to the lower field, 4 families on the affected meadowland who would need to be accommodated. He read through Grange's summary with the attention he gave to everything of consequence, making notes in the margin in his small, dense hand. He was midway through drafting a response concerning compensation for the disrupted families when he stopped. He set the pen down. He had been drafting a sentence about the water meadow, and the word disruption had surfaced something. Not quite a thought, more the texture of one. Concerning a woman who had spent the better part of a dinner managing a situation she should never have been required to manage, with no margin for error and no instrument other than her own judgment, and had done it without disruption of any kind. He sat for a moment with his pen held above the page and his eyes on a point somewhere behind the folio. Then he put the papers aside and did not pick them up again that evening. He had not laughed since the autumn of 1812. He was aware of this, the way one is aware of an absence that has grown so familiar it has ceased to register as absence and begun to feel like the ordinary condition of a room. Edmund had made him laugh easily. Edmund, who had been 3 years his junior, with their father's blue eyes and their mother's particular gift for finding the precise angle at which any formal occasion was also slightly ridiculous. After the fever took Edmund in October of that year, the Duke had found himself without appetite for laughter. Not from grief alone, though grief was present, but from a deeper tiredness, with the world's insistence on performing lightness, when lightness was not what the facts supported. He could not remember the last time he had genuinely wished to be surprised. He thought of this in the study, alone, while the fire settled into its low red diminishment. Then he lit a fresh candle and wrote to his mother. The Dowager Duchess Lavinia had been pressing him toward London since spring, with the persistence of a woman who has decided she is right about something and has elected to treat the matter as purely a question of scheduling. She wanted him settled. She had never been unreasonable about the form this settling should take. She had said on more than one occasion that she did not require him to be in love, only to find a person he could bear to be in a room with, which she offered as a modest standard, and which he had found, in practice, surprisingly resistant to satisfaction. Her house on Curzon Street was always open to him. She kept a good table, maintained her acquaintances with the judicious attention of a woman who understands that a social network is a structure requiring maintenance, and observed the world around her with an irony so well seasoned over 50 years that it had become indistinguishable from wisdom. He wrote that he would come in January. Mrs. Verity Cardew's house on Throgmorton Street was narrow in the way of houses that have been obliged to fit themselves between 2 others, and have done so without entirely forgiving the imposition. 3 stories, a front parlour that received its best light between 10 and noon, a dining room that accommodated 6 comfortably, and 8 at a social cost its hostess had long since decided was acceptable. Mrs. Cardew herself was 52, small-boned, with a widow's black she wore with a certain negligent authority, as though she had been in mourning long enough that the colour had become simply her own. Her affection for Eulalia was genuine, if conducted in a language so unsentimental that a stranger might have failed to recognise it as affection at all. It expressed itself primarily through a brisk and accurate assessment of her niece's prospects, and a willingness to spend what she could spare on improving them. The pale blue gown had been Mrs. Cardew's idea, not the fashionable ice blue the season was currently favouring, something with more depth in it, a restraint in the cut that could not be accused of straining after effect. Eulalia had put it on for the first time in the narrow room on the second floor, and stood before the small glass there for a longer moment than she usually permitted herself for such things. She was not given to vanity, and she was not practicing it now. She was conducting an honest appraisal of the distance between what she was and what the room she was about to enter would expect, and determining whether the gown closed that distance or merely indicated that she was aware it existed. It was the first fine thing she had ever owned. That fact carried a small, specific weight she did not examine directly, but which was there each time she put it on. A faint pressure in the chest, like the awareness of an unfamiliar freedom of movement. The assemblies of the season were conducted with the efficiency of a commercial enterprise and the effect of a performance of ease. Mrs. Cardew navigated them with the quick, accurate eye of a woman who has attended enough of them to have dispensed with novelty, and now concerns herself primarily with outcomes. She introduced Eulalia widely, positioned her near pianofortes and windows whose lighting she had previously reconnoitred, and managed the evenings with a thoroughness Eulalia could respect even as she felt, within the rooms themselves, the particular chill of being appraised and found marginal. It was not cruelty. No one in these rooms was crude enough for cruelty. The assessment was constant, however, and it was honest in the way that markets are honest. And its finding was consistent. She was not what was usually presented, and her failure to be usual was not, in this environment, a point in her favour. She stood at the edges of conversations and watched the centre of the room, and she felt the old knowledge from the border of county ballrooms settle back over her like a familiar coat, unchanged by the blue gown. She had been in London 6 weeks when the Duke of Pendrith arrived in town. She learned it the way one learns most social facts in London, through their consequence rather than their announcement. The Hartmas Ball was on a Thursday in late January, in rooms off Portman Square, with good floors and mediocre portraits. And by 10 o'clock, the assembly had reached the comfortable density at which any further arrival becomes difficult to track. She was standing near the east wall, with a cup of negus she had no intention of drinking, when the quality of the room changed, not loudly, but noticeably, the way a current changes in a river. Without the surface doing anything dramatic to announce it, his name passed through 2 conversations simultaneously. She did not turn to look. She was therefore looking directly at the far wall when he crossed the full length of the ballroom. It was not a short crossing. The room was perhaps 60 feet from the entrance to where she stood, and he made it in the particular manner of a man who is not unaware of being observed, and has, for reasons she could not immediately read, decided that the observation is irrelevant to his direction. He reached her. He bowed. Not the social bow of a man discharging the expected form, but something deliberate in its duration, a fraction longer than convention required, as though he intended it to be recognised as a choice rather than a reflex. "Miss Lindale," he said, "will you dance?" She could not refuse. The etiquette was unambiguous on that point. But as he led her onto the floor, she understood, from the quality of his attention, from the particular silence he maintained for the first measure, giving her time to find the step before he spoke, that the question had not been one he had asked because the occasion required it. The dance was a country set which permitted conversation in the gaps between figures. He used them with an economy she recognised as characteristic. "I find," he said, during the first pause, "that London contains a very great deal of conversation about itself." "It is its primary subject," she agreed. "I am not adapted to it." He said this as a fact, without apology. "I am told I should persevere." "By whom?" "My mother." A brief pause. "She is generally correct about things she has had 30 years to consider." She laughed, briefly, without premeditation, and caught the edge of something shift in his expression. Not a smile precisely, but a preparation for one, a softening at the corner of the eyes, the faintest easing of the jaw. She noted it the way she noted the moment the kitchen fire finally drew, after half an hour of resistance. By the second interval he had said, without particular preamble, that he would rather speak with her than with any other person presently in London, and that he found this preference so significant a departure from his general disposition that he had decided to act on it rather than permit it to pass unexamined. He said it in the same direct register he had brought to her father's dinner table, the register of a man who has, at some point, stopped calculating the distance between what he thinks and what he says, and found the distance was not worth the maintenance. He called at Throgmorton Street 3 days later. Mrs. Cardew received him with a composure of extraordinary quality. She had spent the intervening days in a state of focused alertness, presented outwardly as unconcerned routine, and withdrew to the back parlour at the precise moment when her continued presence would have been more hindrance than propriety required, with the timing of a woman who has thought carefully about when to become invisible. He brought a book. This was unexpected. It was a volume of sermons by a divine of some recent reputation, octavo format, burgundy cloth boards, the pages still faintly stiff with newness, suggesting it had been recently purchased rather than drawn from any existing library. He set it on the low table between them and said he had heard it spoken of with the highest admiration and had been curious whether she had formed a view of it. She looked at it. She picked it up, opened it at the middle, and read 3 sentences. "It is pompous," she said. "The author has no experience of poverty or fear. He writes about both with great confidence." He was quiet for a moment. "You have read him before." "I have read these 3 sentences. They are sufficient." She set the volume down, spine up, the way one sets down a book one does not intend to return to. A man who has never wanted for anything material generally holds very firm views about the spiritual benefits of material deprivation in others. "You have," he said, with something close to satisfaction in his voice. "A genius for spoiling comfortable opinions." "Only because comfortable opinions tend to deserve it." "Yes," he said. The single syllable, with the quality of attention that stood behind it, suggested he was finding the conversation not an obligation to be discharged, but an event to be attended to. He called twice more before the month ended. Mrs. He called twice more before the month ended. Mrs. Cardew observed these visits with the composed attention of a woman who has determined that the surest way to damage a promising situation is to be seen managing it. And so she managed it, by leaving the room at precisely the right moments, and saying very little when she returned. She noted the length of the calls. She noted the quality of what came from the front parlour afterward, the kind of quiet that carries more occupancy than most rooms manage with full conversation. And she kept her counsel, which cost her something and was to her credit. The third call, he brought nothing. He sat down in the chair he had taken on the 2 previous occasions, and after the tea was poured and Mrs. Cardew had found her reason to withdraw, he was quiet for long enough that the clock on the mantel became audible. She let it be quiet. She had found, over the years, that silence was rarely as empty as it presented itself, and that filling it too quickly was almost always a mistake. "I came," he said at last, to ask whether you would walk in the garden. It was February. The garden at Throgmorton Street was a thin strip of grey ground behind the house, bordered by a wall from which, improbably, a climbing rose had survived the winter in a dormant state, bare canes against old stone, the colour of rust. He said nothing as they walked its length, which took perhaps 4 minutes. Then he stopped at the wall and turned to face her, and she understood from the particular quality of his stillness that whatever he was about to say had been assembled over a long preparation, and was being offered now with the full weight of that effort behind it. He said he wished to propose a marriage. He said he wished to be exact about the terms of it, because he believed imprecision in such matters was a form of dishonesty, and he had found, over the past weeks, that he could not be dishonest with her. Not because he had decided to be honest, but because honesty in her presence appeared to be, for reasons he could not satisfactorily explain, the only register available to him. The marriage he offered was one of mutual benefit. His name and title, his protection, a household managed at her competence. On his part, respect, honesty, the freedom to govern the domestic arrangements entirely as she saw fit. He did not offer love. He wanted her to understand this clearly. He was not frozen, or not only frozen. He was, he said, in some fundamental way, not available. There was no deceit in this. It was the truth as he knew it. She looked at him for a moment. Behind him, the bare canes of the rose made their rust-coloured lines against the grey stone. "The ice is already cracking," she said. "You know this." He did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened, the way it did, she had noticed, when something had reached him. Then he said, very quietly, that there was someone he should tell her about. Eulalia had heard the name Edmund once, briefly, in a social context she had not thought to pursue. A passing reference in a conversation about the Pendrith family's seat that her aunt had relayed without particular emphasis. She had formed no picture of him. What she had not known, and what Philip told her now, standing at the grey wall in the grey February garden, was the shape of the loss. A younger brother who had carried the warmth both of them needed into the world, and who had been taken by a fever in October of 1812, with the abrupt finality of a door closing in a high wind. Philip told it in the abbreviated manner of someone who has never told it before and does not know, without practice, how much of it can be contained in language. Some of it refused to be contained. He stopped twice, in the middle of sentences, and she stood with him in those stops, without moving toward them or away. The way she had learned to stand beside her father in his worst hours, close enough to be present, careful enough not to require anything of the silence. When he finished, she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." He reached past her and took the single late rose that had been trying against all reason to hold on at the end of one bare cane. A small, winter-pale thing, more a suggestion of a rose than a rose in full form, as though the plant had made one last argument against the season, and nearly won. He gave it to her without a word. She tucked it into the front of her gown, where it stayed through the remainder of the afternoon and into the evening. And she did not examine what it meant to carry it there, because some things are best left unexamined, until they have had time to become themselves. High Hall in June was a different proposition from High Hall in the abstract. Eulalia had prepared herself for grandeur, had pictured grey stone and tall windows and the austere organisation of a house run for impression rather than comfort. What she had not prepared for was the scale of it, The way the building sat in the landscape not as an imposing object, but as a fact, settled and unarguable as a hill, surrounded by the long pale green of the park and the smell of cut grass and warm limestone rising together in the June light. It asked nothing of you. It simply was, and had been for 200 years, and intended to continue. The upper servants were assembled in the entrance hall in the order of their precedence. Eulalia walked down the line with the composed attention she brought to every introduction, noting faces, names, what each face said about what it thought of her. At the far end of the line stood Mrs. Orme, 50 or thereabouts, dressed in the uncompromising black of a woman who has made herself into an institution. Her back so straight it might have been constructed for demonstration purposes. She had managed High Hall for 31 years. The quality of her reception, perfectly correct, positioned just at the edge of warmth, close enough to the boundary that it was not technically a transgression, told Eulalia in a single appraisal what she was dealing with. She was almost at the end of the line when she stopped. The young housemaid at the far corner of the hall, Nan Briggs, as Eulalia would shortly learn, 14 years old and lately come from a family in the village, was standing very still with the concentrated stillness of someone whose body is engaged in a project separate from and overriding all social obligations. Her face had the particular grey-white quality of illness in its early stages, and her hands at her sides were gripped against themselves. Eulalia turned to the footman beside her. "Take her to the servants' hall and bring her broth and a blanket. She is not well." Mrs. Orme's voice came from behind her, measured and precise. "Your Grace, the girl is perfectly—" "She is not perfectly anything," Eulalia said, without heat. She turned to meet Mrs. Orme's gaze, which required a brief but direct effort of will from both of them. "A house is known by how it treats those who can do nothing for it. We will know this house by its best standard, not its minimum." A silence of approximately 3 seconds, which was, in this context, a very long time. "Yes, Your Grace," Mrs. Orme said. The story moved through the servants' quarters, with the efficiency stories always move when they concern something significant about the quality of what has arrived. By the following morning, Mrs. Orme was conducting her weekly household review with an attention of a different kind. Not the attention of a woman defending occupied ground, but the attention of a woman considering whether the ground has changed beneath her. The great dining room table seated 20. At its full extent, Eulalia calculated, it was perhaps 22 feet of polished mahogany, recently beeswaxed to a depth of reflection that showed you your own face back from the surface, slightly elongated, slightly dark. She stood at the head of it and considered the 2 place settings laid at opposite ends in the arrangement evidently customary for the household, separated by enough table that a conversation conducted across it would need to be raised to the level of an announcement. She found Thomas, the senior footman, and gave him his instructions. Both places were to be laid at the near end from now on, close enough for the table between them to be a table rather than a passage of open ground. Philip came in to dinner and stopped. He looked at the 2 settings positioned side by side at the near end of the table and the long, empty length of mahogany stretching away from them into the far shadow of the room. He said nothing. He sat down beside her. When the fish course arrived, he passed her the salt before she had reached for it. It was a small thing. She filed it. That evening, he raised the mill question, the folio of correspondence from Grange that had been waiting since the autumn, the water rights, the drainage work. He had made his decision, but he wanted to go over the details with her. She listened to the plan and asked, with an evenness that did not signal criticism in advance of thought, what would become of the 4 families whose water meadow would be affected by the construction? Whether they had been consulted? Whether the flooding of the low field would cost them the grazing they depended on through the winter months? He paused. "I've not addressed that directly," he said. "It wants addressing first," she said. He built the mill further down. The library at High Hall ran the full length of the east wing. 2 tall windows looking out over the kitchen garden. The shelves arranged not by category, but by some prior hand's private and now unrecoverable logic, so that sermons sat beside travel accounts and natural philosophy rubbed against poetry in a way that suggested a mind more interested in conversation between books than in their orderly separation. On a shelf near the second window, between a volume of botanical engravings and a collected edition of parliamentary speeches, she found it. A novel called The Mysteries of Ravenswood House, printed 1807, its boards warped from some earlier encounter with damp, its pages foxed and slightly swollen. She opened it at the middle and read 3 paragraphs and knew exactly what she was holding. On a Tuesday evening in November, with the rain coming in off the park and the fire at its most cooperative, she read aloud from it. She read in the voice the text seemed to demand, 1 degree more solemn than necessary, and offered, between passages, a commentary whose function was purely corrective. The heroine's flight across the moors received a brief meteorological observation. The villain's declaration was given a practical annotation. The secret passage was interrogated for structural plausibility and found wanting on several counts. Philip was at the other end of the hearthrug with papers in his hand, and for the first quarter hour she was not certain he was attending. Then she delivered her verdict on the second secret passage, a tunnel, the author insisted, running directly beneath a chalk hill, which she noted would have required either the suspension of geology or an engineering achievement for which the novel offered no explanation. And she heard him. It was not a polite sound. It was not the contained, disciplined response of a man acknowledging something cleverly said. It was the laugh of a man caught entirely off guard by a particular kind of delight, brief and helpless. The laugh of someone who has been ambushed by genuine pleasure and has no prepared response to it because it has been long enough that he has forgotten preparation was necessary. He set the papers down. He said, with a quality of recovery in his voice, that she should continue. She continued. The Dowager Duchess Lavinia arrived from London in late September with 2 carriages, a lady's maid of profound convictions and a prepared disposition toward disappointment. She was small and sharp-featured, with her younger son's blue eyes and a social intelligence so well maintained over 5 decades that it had long since become indistinguishable from genuine perception. She had expected, from what she could construct of the circumstances, either a schemer or a fool, and was prepared for either. Within 3 days she had been given a third option, for which she was less prepared. On the first morning, Eulalia had moved the dowager's rooms from the north-facing guest suite, grandest in the house, icily correct, positioned to receive the formal northern light that suited portraits and made everything and everyone within it look slightly deceased, to the 2 south-facing rooms overlooking the walled garden, where the October sun came in between 10 and 2, and the beds had been aired with lavender rather than the estate's customary cedar. The dowager said nothing about this when Eulalia came to inquire how she had slept, but she said, after a moment, that she had slept adequately. This was, Mrs. Orme later informed Eulalia, in a tone of some significance, the first time in 12 years of autumn visits that the Dowager Duchess had described her sleep at High Hall as adequate. By the end of the week she had become something else entirely. She took to intercepting Eulalia in the morning room with the brisk purposefulness of a woman who has located her preferred conversational partner and intends to be efficient about it. On Thursday, after a discussion of the household drainage that had somehow become a discussion of principle, she set down her embroidery frame and looked at Eulalia directly. "He is not frozen with you," she said. "You know that." "I have some evidence for it," Eulalia said carefully. "When the time comes," the dowager said, "say it plainly. He has had too much silence on the subject of the things that matter." She picked up the embroidery frame again, signalling that the topic was considered addressed. "He will not say it first. He will feel it first and thoroughly, and keep it to himself until he has organized it into something he considers presentable. You should not wait for that stage. Eulalia carried this observation out of the morning room and continued to carry it, in the particular way she carried things she was not ready to act on, like a stone in her coat pocket, weighted and present, felt at intervals with the same thumb. She found Edmund's room by accident. She was looking for the linen cupboard in the east passage and opened a door that was locked but yielded to a key she had not known was on the ring. One of the old, heavy iron keys that the housekeeper's ring carried, in order of some antiquity, Eulalia had not yet entirely decoded. The room was dark, the curtains drawn against the sun, the air carrying the particular stilled quality of a space that has been kept rather than abandoned, dusted, maintained, preserved exactly in the arrangement of a particular day that had not been yesterday. The writing desk was clear, except for a folded piece of paper and a miniature portrait in a hinged case of dark blue leather. The portrait of a young man with his father's blue eyes and an expression of such uncomplicated openness that it stopped her at the threshold. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she heard Philip behind her in the passage. He stopped when he saw the open door. She did not step aside or draw back. She simply stood where she was and looked at him. And what she offered him in that look was not pity, and not an invitation to explain himself, and not the managed kindness of someone who has decided in advance how grief should be approached. It was only her presence, steady and unhurried. The same presence she had brought to her father's worst evenings, to the kitchen at Nettlecombe at 5 in the morning, to every situation she had found required bearing witness rather than resolving. He came to stand beside her in the doorway. He looked at the room, at the miniature in its blue leather case, at the clear desk, at the curtains drawn against the summer afternoon. The two of them stood in the quiet together, while the distant sound of the kitchen garden reached them faintly through the wall. A door, a voice. The ordinary noise of the house continuing its business on the other side of this particular stillness. Then he reached over, without looking at her, and took her hand. It was the first time he had reached for her. She felt the pressure of his fingers close over hers, firm, deliberate, the grip of a man anchoring himself, and she held it without making anything of it. The way she had learned to hold the best things, without fuss, without commentary, only with care. Outside, in the long park, the October light had dropped to that particular low amber of late afternoon that makes difficult things look briefly bearable. The kind of light that does not lie exactly, but chooses its emphasis with care. It came through the east passage window in a long, level bar that reached the floor of the corridor and stopped just short of the doorway where they stood. Philip drew the door to Edmund's room closed. Not all the way, he left it fractionally open, the latch not quite catching, in the way of someone who has decided against the definitive gesture, but is not yet ready for the opposite one. Eulalia did not comment on this. She kept her hand in his for a moment longer, and then she let it go with a naturalness that offered him nothing to have to respond to. And they walked back down the east passage together, in the kind of silence that has weight and composition to it, that is different in its quality from all the silences she had known before she came here, which had mostly been the silence of absence. At the end of the passage, she stopped at the window that looked out over the kitchen garden. The last of the runner beans were being taken down by one of the outdoor men. A steady, deliberate pulling of the dry tendrils from the frame, each length coiled as it came free, organised for next year's tying. She watched this for a moment without any particular consciousness of watching it. Then she went downstairs to see about dinner. The winter passed at High Hall with a quality of incremental deepening, the way ice melts from the centre of a pond outward, not visible until it is nearly complete, and then suddenly impossible to miss. She could not have said afterward, at what precise point the silence between them had changed its character. Only that somewhere, in the passage from November to February, the silences had become something she looked toward rather than around. He brought her the estate correspondence now as a matter of course, not asking for instruction, but for a perspective he had decided, apparently, was worth having. She asked questions that he had not thought to ask, and he incorporated the answers into decisions that affected the 4 families near the mill, the repairs to the tenant cottages along the North Lane, the provision for Nam Briggs's mother, who was ill and had no means of support. He began to anticipate the questions. He began, which was perhaps more significant, to ask them himself before she arrived. In the library on a Thursday evening in January, while sleet drove against the east windows and the fire behind the grate had reached its full cooperative height, he set down the correspondence he had been reading and looked at her across the hearthrug, for long enough that she looked up from the Ravenswood novel — she had gone back to it for reasons she did not trouble to explain — and met his eyes. He said nothing. She said nothing. After a moment she returned to the novel and read aloud the passage in which the heroine crosses a moor in inadequate footwear and insufficient moonlight to reach a man who has given her no reason to trust his motives. And she offered her annotation of the heroine's decision in the dry, precise voice the material demanded. He listened until she finished, and when she closed the book, he was still looking at her. And there was something in his expression that the room's firelight did not entirely account for. She did not examine what she carried out of that evening. She had Lavinia's instruction in her coat pocket, as it were. Say it plainly, when the time comes. And she was not yet certain the time had come. What she was certain of was that something in the house had changed, and that the change had been going on for longer than either of them had named. London in late April had the particular quality of a city that has been waiting for spring with unseemly eagerness, and has over-committed to it on arrival. Everything coming into blossom, and open window and morning promenade at once. The social season unfurling with the concentrated intensity of a mechanism that has been wound over a long winter and released. The park was full. The drawing rooms were full. The correspondence that moved between houses carried more current than the post, and the information travelling in it was frequently more accurate. It was through this network that Lady Sidonia Mall first received the news. She was at her dressing table when her maid, Hester, delivered it. Delivered it with the careful neutrality of someone conveying information about a fire. Informative, not responsible for its origin. The Duke of Pendrith had married a Miss Eulalia Lindale of Somerset. No connections of consequence, no fortune, a small entailed property of diminishing value. The wedding had been quiet, in town, in February. Sidonia sat very still for a moment, looking at her own reflection. She was genuinely beautiful, which had never been merely advantageous. It had been, for most of her adult life, her primary instrument, maintained and deployed with the careful attention that any precision instrument requires. She was 31, which was not young in the way the season measured youth, but she carried it without anxiety because she had always understood that her value lay not in the first impression, but in the sustained presence, the quality of patience that could wait through a man's grief and his withdrawal and his long indifference without appearing to wait. She had been patient. She had been, she knew, exceptionally patient. She had ordered a miniature painted 3 years ago of High Hall, a small thing, ivory-backed, the size of a calling card, the stone facade rendered in careful detail in a blue leather case. She had told the miniaturist it was a commission for a friend. She had kept it in the second drawer of her writing table, beneath the correspondence she did not need frequently. In the manner of an object one does not look at directly, but retains because discarding it would constitute an acknowledgement she was not prepared to make. She took it out now and held it in both hands. The miniature was beautifully done. The hall's long windows, the stone warm in painted summer light, the park laid out in its formal order behind it. A house she had studied the dimensions of. A house she had understood herself to be moving toward. She turned it over once, set it face down on the dressing table, and told Hester she would not be receiving callers that morning. The next day, she began to think. The mechanism she chose was Lady Finchley, who was one of those people whose talent for the circulation of damaging information was so well established that calling upon it was simply a matter of knowing the correct approach. The connection between them was maintained through a shared maid, a woman named Dulcie, who moved between their households with an efficiency of information transfer that neither party examined too directly. Sidonia did not summon Lady Finchley or write to her. She said the things she wished said in Dulcie's hearing, in the confidence of the dressing room, and relied on the established mechanism to do what it had always done. The story, as it left Sidonia's dressing room, was this: that the famous account of the Lyndale dinner, by then circulating in London as a tale of charming originality, a country girl who had spoken frankly to a duke and won his admiration, was, in its true version, considerably less charming. That the woman had scolded him like a fishwife over the mutton. That the duke, in his famous controlled manner, had been too astonished to refuse her. That what had been described as wit was in fact the belligerence of a woman who had nothing to lose, and the social intelligence to understand that outrage, properly applied, could serve the same function as appeal. Lady Finchley told it first at the Ashford card party. She had the gift of the anecdote, the timing, the illustrative pause, the look of mild regret that says, "I would not ordinarily repeat this, but accuracy requires it." By the time it had passed through 4 more drawing rooms, it had acquired several small embellishments. A detail about a ruined sauce, a raised voice, none of which had been in the original version, all of which made it more vivid and therefore more persuasive. The story had, by the middle of May, reached a quality of currency that made it unnecessary to attribute it. It circulated on its own momentum, sourced only by the collective willingness to find it believable. It arrived at Highhall not as a direct report, but as a change in weather. Eulalia first noticed it in the quality of correspondence. 2 invitations that would previously have been extended without question, delayed or rerouted in ways their authors clearly hoped would not be noticed. Then a call from the Weston family, who lived 4 miles north and with whom she had begun to establish the careful, mutual respect of county neighbours. The call was brief, the wife's manner pleasant but slightly raised, as though she were conducting it from a polite distance rather than across a drawing room. The conversation remained entirely on the surface and stayed there. After they left, Eulalia stood at the window and traced the change with the precision she brought to household accounts. Something had altered, and the alteration had an external source. And the nature of the source required identifying. She did not tell Philip. She knew what she knew, and she was still building the picture. What she had was not yet a shape she could present to him clearly, and she would not present it unclearly. The shape resolved itself on a Wednesday afternoon in early June, when 2 carriages arrived in the front drive within 10 minutes of each other, and discharged Lady St Ives and Mrs Pomeroy, both Somerset County families of long establishment. Both women whom Eulalia had met twice in a context of formal courtesy that had not progressed significantly beyond formality. They arrived together, which was not customary. They arrived with the practiced ease of people who have agreed in advance on the purpose of a visit and are conducting themselves accordingly. Mrs Orme showed them in. Tea was brought, the Sèvres service, the white ground with its narrow border of painted garnet, which Mrs Orme had selected for county calls of the first order. Eulalia poured. Lady St Ives admired the rooms. She admired them at length, with a thoroughness of admiration that exceeded what genuine admiration requires, and entered the territory of demonstration. The way a particularly well-maintained facade is admired, with an appreciation that contains within it the unspoken awareness that the facade has cost something, and that questions about the cost are being gently deferred. Mrs. Pomeroy followed her lead with the comfortable fluency of a woman who has done this before. The drawing room was magnificent. The grounds were magnificent. The management of so great an establishment, she paused here with a sympathetic tilt of the head, must be a considerable undertaking for one accustomed to a more domestic scale. Such responsibilities, she implied, in the warmest and least accountable register available to a woman of her social education, were perhaps most naturally suited to those bred to them. Eulalia poured the second cup, with the steadiness that had served her at her father's table, in her aunt's London house, in the servants' hall at High Hall, in every room that had ever tried to make her feel the edge of its boundary. "The story you are referring to is entirely accurate," she said pleasantly. "I did tell him he was discourteous, because he was. My husband values plain speech. It is, as I understand it, one of the principal reasons he married me, rather than someone who would not tell him the truth." She offered the cup across the table. "More tea, Lady St. Ives?" Lady St. Ives took the cup. The expression she had prepared for a different response occupied her face for a moment, without the response it had been designed for, and then rearranged itself into something requiring rather more work to maintain. Mrs. Pomeroy studied the garnet border of her saucer with the attentiveness of a woman identifying an exit. They stayed another 20 minutes, in which the conversation resided exclusively on the subjects of the weather and a neighbour's garden, and then they left. Eulalia sat alone in the drawing-room for a time after the carriages had gone. The Sèvres cups were still on the table, and the fire was still burning, and outside the June Park was entirely indifferent to the afternoon's business. She sat with her hands in her lap and felt the old sensation, the one she had first learned at the edge of county assemblies, at the border of rooms that had decided without informing her that she was not quite their centre, settle over her with its familiar patience. She went to the writing table. She took a sheet of paper and wrote to her father. A brief letter, not quite honest and not quite dishonest. The kind of letter one writes when the truth is not yet in a form that can be transmitted, without doing damage to the recipient who cannot act on it. She told him she was well. She told him the park was fine in June. She told him that Philip sent his regards, which was a liberty of expression she had not verified, but which she judged was in the spirit of what Philip would say if he were in the habit of saying such things spontaneously. She folded the letter, addressed it in her clear hand, and put it in the second drawer of the writing table without sealing it. She had understood, by the time she put it away, that what had arrived at the door this afternoon was not an incident. It was a survey. Someone had sent those two women to take the temperature of the room, to find whether Eulalia could be destabilised by social pressure, applied in the precise register of concerned female solidarity, which was the hardest register to refuse without appearing graceless. And the fact that she had refused it, and had done so in front of both of them, and had offered more tea, would be reported back to whoever had sent them. And whoever had sent them would note the result and revise the approach. She had read the Ravenswood novel, with its badly surveyed tunnels and its heroine making poor decisions about footwear in darkness. She was not that heroine. She understood, with the same clarity she brought to household accounts, that the next move would not be a drawing-room call or a whispered party anecdote. It would be something larger, something that required an audience already assembled, where the architecture of the situation made withdrawal difficult. Philip was giving a ball at High Hall in late summer. The invitations were already written, the date set, the county informed. The social occasion at which a house presents itself and its occupants to the assembled judgment of the world. The campaign had found its ground. Outside, the June light was still high and generous over the park, falling equally on the long formal beds and the empty drive and the bare upper windows of the east wing, which held their afternoon light without comment, the way stone holds everything, not discriminating between what it carries, not releasing any of it before it is ready. Somewhere in London, in a house Eulalia had never visited, someone was deciding what to wear. The 23rd of August arrived with the particular authority of dates that have been fixed in household diaries long enough to acquire a gravitational pull of their own. For 6 weeks, it had organised everything around itself. The provisions ordered, the holland covers lifted from the ballroom chandeliers, the musicians engaged from Bath, the wine brought up from the cellar in careful sequence by Thomas, who had been moving between the cellar and the ballroom anteroom since 6 in the morning, with the focused efficiency of a man who understands that the reputation of a house is assembled from precisely these unobserved preparations. He had set the sconces himself, each one checked for level and steady flame. He had instructed the 3 temporary footmen brought in from the village in the correct angle for presenting a tray, a demonstration he had given with a seriousness that suggested he considered it a matter of some moral weight. By 4 in the afternoon, when the late summer light began its long decline toward gold, the great ballroom at High Hall was as ready as Thomas and Mrs. Orme's combined authority could make it, which was, by any measure available, extraordinarily ready. Mrs. Orme had been in the ballroom herself that afternoon for a final inspection. She had run her white-gloved finger along the mantelpiece, verified the arrangement of the cut flowers, white roses and late summer greenery, 8 vases along the far wall, and stood for a moment at the centre of the parquet floor, looking at the room the way a general looks at a field before the engagement, noting the strong positions, the sight lines, the places where the evening could go wrong, and the preparations she had made to prevent it. She had managed this house through the old Duke's last years, through the heir's long absence, through the period of cold economy and the recent thaw. She knew what the evening meant. She had, by now, a clear view of what the Duchess was worth, and she had staked her considerable domestic authority on that view, which was something she did not do lightly. The gown was laid out on the bed when Eulalia came upstairs at 5:30. Philip had sent it from London in July. Pale silk, the colour of cream in winter light, neither ivory nor white but something cooler, more considered. The cut was simple in the way that things made by people who understand their material are simple, without any feature that asked attention for itself, which meant the whole of it asked attention instead. She had not tried it on since it arrived. She had been occupied. She had, she knew, been avoiding the moment of putting it on, which was the kind of avoidance she did not usually permit herself, and had noted in herself with the dispassionate accuracy she brought to every other form of household inventory. She dressed with her maid, Patrice, a woman of 35, who had come with the position and was exact in her work without being intrusive in her manner, which Eulalia had found, over the months, to be a combination of qualities she valued considerably. Patrice arranged her hair with a restraint that trusted the silk to carry the occasion, and did not attempt to compete with it. A pair of pearl drops at the ears, the Duke's wedding gift, simple and old, belonging to a prior duchess who had, according to Lavinia, been a woman of taste. When Patrice stepped back and indicated, wordlessly, that the work was done, Eulalia turned to the glass. She stood in front of it for a moment, not studying herself precisely, conducting, again, the honest appraisal she had performed in the narrow room at Throgmorton Street before the first London Assembly, measuring the distance between what she was and what the room she was about to enter would require. The distance had changed since then. She understood this. The change was real, and she was grateful for it, and she was, standing in the silk in the August light of her own dressing room, still afraid. The fear was specific. She had identified it over the past 6 weeks with the precision she gave everything she needed to understand. It was not the fear of appearing inadequate before the assembled county. She had been found inadequate before and had survived the finding. It was the fear that the evening had been designed by someone who understood how these mechanisms work, to place her in a situation where the difference between appearing inadequate and being destroyed was thinner than it looked from the outside, and where one wrong move in the wrong register, too cold, too warm, too defended, too exposed, would provide exactly the material the mechanism needed. Philip found her there. He came in without knocking, which he had begun to do some months past, in the way that small permissions accumulate between two people until they cease to be permissions at all and become simply the ordinary traffic of a shared life. He was already dressed, the dark coat, the white cravat, the plain and absolute authority of a man who has never needed to use formal dress to indicate what he was. And he stopped when he saw her at the glass. And he read her with the attention he had been directing at her for nearly a year now, which had grown accurate enough that she no longer thought to conceal things from it. He crossed the room and stood behind her. He looked at her in the glass for a moment. Then he put his hands on her shoulders and turned her gently away from it, so that she was facing him rather than her own reflection. "I need to say something before we go down," he said. His voice was at its most level, which she had learned meant he had been organising this for some time, and was now delivering it from a place of considerable internal effort. "I need to say it precisely because I should have said it a good while ago and did not, which is a failure of honesty on my part, and honesty has been the basis of everything between us from the beginning." She looked at him and waited. "I did not marry you to be left in peace," he said. "I told you something like that in the garden in February. And it was true then, as far as I understood myself, but it was not complete. I married you because you were the only living thing, since Edmund, that had managed to reach me. Not past my guard, not through it, but as though the guard were simply not there when you were present. I could not let that go. And I tell in front of this house full of people tonight that what I feel is anything less than what it is." He paused. "I love you. That is the specific thing I did not say in the garden, and I'm saying it now, in this room, before we go down." She put her hand flat against his chest. His heart was going hard and fast beneath the linen and the wool, not concealed at all, entirely present. The body's evidence for what the voice had just said. She felt it under her palm, with the same quality of attention she had brought to the warmth of the teapot in the Nettlecombe kitchen, to the winter rose tucked against her collarbone, to every small physical fact she had ever carried carefully, because the things she could hold, she could trust. She said nothing yet. She held her hand there for a moment. Then she said, "We should go down." He offered her his arm, and they went. The great hall was full before they reached the foot of the stairs. High Hall received guests with a natural amplitude, ceilings tall enough to absorb the noise of 200 people and return it softened. The August evening still warm enough that the long windows along the garden side had been opened to let the park air through, so that the smell of cut grass and warm stone moved through the candlelit rooms in a way that made the whole interior feel continuous with the grounds. The boundary between house and landscape gentled by the season. The chandeliers, Thomas's work, each sconce burning true, threw a light that was warm but not flattering in the theatrical way of insufficient illumination. It was honest light. It showed things as they were, which Eulalia had decided, when she chose the candles, was the only kind of light she was prepared to host by. Lavinia was stationed near the door to the saloon, positioned with the unconscious territorial instinct of a woman who has spent 50 years understanding exactly which spot in a room exerts the most influence on the flow of arrivals. She was in deep violet, a colour that had been hers for so long it seemed less like a choice than a natural property of her person, and she had about her the alert, satisfied look of someone who has been waiting for something to begin and has every confidence it will go as she has planned. She took Eulalia's free hand as they passed, pressed it once, with a firmness that conveyed a specific message. I am here. I know what this evening is. You are not conducting it alone. And released it without ceremony. The county had come. The Westons, the Ashfords, the Trelawneys from the north side of the county, the Hartley Moores from Bath. Sir Richard Fenwick, who had known Philip's father and had watched the Duke's 7 years of withdrawal with the helpless concern of an old friendship that could not reach what it was concerned for. He shook Philip's hand in the doorway, with both of his, and said nothing of consequence. But the grip was long, and the look on his face was not social. Near the window, Eulalia recognised the profile of Lady Finchley, the woman who had carried Sidonia's story through London drawing rooms in May, who had told it at the Ashford card party with the timing and the look of mild regret, and who was here tonight in pale green, holding a glass, watching the room. Eulalia noted her position and moved on. She had not told Philip about Sidonia's campaign. She had made this decision deliberately and early, and she had not revised it. What he knew, he would want to act on, and the only effective action available to him would have made her position worse by making her appear to require protection. The defence of the position was hers to conduct. Philip understood this, she thought, without having been told. Or he understood that something was being managed without pressing to know its specifics, which amounted to the same thing and was, in its way, another form of the respect that had made it possible to be honest with him from the beginning. What Philip did not know, that Sidonia had organised the drawing-room visits in June, that Lady Finchley was her instrument, that the ball had been identified months ago as the venue for whatever final move the campaign intended. He knew that 2 county ladies had called and left without satisfaction. He did not know why they had come or who had sent them. Eulalia had told him the calls were unremarkable, and they had both understood that this was not the complete account, and had agreed, without discussion, to proceed on that understanding. She saw Sidonia at 9:11. She was standing near the foot of the secondary staircase that opened into the east end of the ballroom, a position that was not the most conspicuous in the room, but which had the specific advantage of being the point through which the majority of guests passed on their way between the supper room and the dancing floor. She was wearing silver. Not the fashionable silver of the season, which was pale and insubstantial. This was something richer, with depth in the weave, a fabric that moved with its own authority. Her dark hair was dressed high, and she wore no jewellery except a pair of earrings in cut jet that gave back the chandelier light in small, precise points. She was beautiful in the way that has patience in it, a beauty assembled over years of careful maintenance, presented tonight with all its investment visible. She was smiling at something a man to her left had said, and she did not glance at Eulalia, and she did not need to. She had positioned herself and she was waiting. And she had, this was evident to Eulalia, in the same way that a household problem is evident before it has been articulated, arranged the knot of 4 or 5 people around her with the care that a hostess applies to the formation of a desirable social cluster, so that its dissolution would require an observable effort. Lady Finchley was among them. A young baronet whose name Eulalia had not yet fixed, who was laughing at something. 2 women whose faces she had seen at the harness ball in January, who had watched the Duke cross the room and then watched Eulalia with the evaluative quality of people noting an upset in the order of things. Eulalia took a glass from a passing tray, held it, and did not drink from it. She crossed the floor. She was within speaking range when Sidonia looked up. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds, a calibrated appraisal, the kind that takes in an amount of information about which the face reveals nothing, and then the smile broadened to include her. Sidonia said, in a voice pitched to carry just enough without appearing raised. How lovely it was to see the house so splendid, And how brave, brave, the word placed with the precision of a pin. How brave it was of Eulalia to attempt so grand an entertainment, with so much to manage and so little of the ordinary precedent to draw on. The country air, she added, with a warm finality, gave everything such a refreshing quality. The cluster waited. Lady Finchley looked at her fan. The young baronet had stopped laughing. Eulalia looked at Sidonia with the steadiness she had applied to her father's account books and to the cracked rim of the teapot, and to every situation she had ever found required looking at directly rather than obliquely. "Lady Sidonia," she said pleasantly, "I know what you lost when he married me. I think you may have loved this house, or loved the idea of what it contained, for a very long time." She said it without accusation, without heat, in the voice she might have used for a fact she was sorry to name, but was prepared to name correctly. "I am genuinely sorry that it came out as it did, and that the disappointment has sat with you as it has. A person who is not ashamed of herself cannot be shamed by someone who is." She paused. "I wish you well. I mean that without any irony and without any condition. I hope the season treats you kindly." Sidonia's smile did not disappear at once. It completed its present form first, finished it, and then the architecture behind it ceased to sustain it, and it ended. What was left in her face, for a moment before the social training resumed its governance, was something Eulalia had not expected. Not fury, and not humiliation exactly, but a specific, private exhaustion. As though a weight she had been carrying for a long time had been named in public, and the naming had not relieved it, but had made it harder to continue carrying it in the same way. She said something, a brief, correct reply, perfectly formed, and turned to the baronet beside her with a renewed attention that indicated the previous conversation was concluded. Within the hour she had her cloak sent for. The cluster dispersed. Lady Finchley moved away toward the supper room with the purposeful direction of a woman who has somewhere she urgently needs to be that is not here. Sir Richard Fenwick, who had been standing near the wall to Eulalia's right and had heard everything, looked at her with an expression she did not have time to read, before he inclined his head at a fraction that was not quite a bow, but functioned as one, turned, and said something into the ear of his wife beside him. She became aware of Philip. He was on the other side of the floor, and he had been watching. Not the specific words, she thought, which were too far, and the music too present, but the shape of the encounter. He knew. She saw him know it in the way his whole carriage changed, the set of his shoulders, the quality of his stillness, as he crossed toward her through the assembled guests, who made a path for him with the unconscious accommodation the room always gave him, and who were watching now in the frank and interested way of a crowd that understands it is witnessing something. He reached her. He took her hand, her right hand, and raised it to his lips. It was not a perfunctory gesture. He held it there long enough to be a statement rather than a courtesy, and the statement was of a clarity that required no interpretation from anyone present in that room. Every person who had heard Sidonia Mal's version of the Lindale dinner and found it credible. Every person who had waited all evening to discover whether the arrangement between the Duke and his country wife was the thing it had been presented as, or the thing Sidonia's version had made of it. They had their answer now. Delivered in the language a room of this kind reads most fluently. The language of position and gesture, of who stands where and reaches for whom when no protocol requires it. It was not a declaration for the benefit of the room, but the room received it as one, and the room was not wrong. He lowered her hand. He did not release it. Lavinia, still positioned near the saloon door, watched this with an expression she did not bother to arrange into neutrality. A small, exact satisfaction. The expression of a woman who has been correct about something important for a long time, and is allowing herself, in private, the acknowledgement of it. She turned to Sir Richard Fenwick's wife, who had come to stand beside her, and said something that was too far away to hear. Lady Fenwick looked across the room at Philip and Eulalia, and then at Lavinia, and she nodded, once, in the way of a woman recognising a settled question. Lady Finchley found her evening bag near the supper-room entrance, exchanged brief words with an acquaintance whose name she did not trouble to remember, and moved steadily toward the front of the house. She did not dance that evening, and she was gone before the second supper was laid. Thomas, crossing the ballroom with a tray of champagne glasses, noted the positions of the guests near the east staircase, noted the quality of the remaining conversation, and made the intuitive accounting of a man who has worked grand occasions long enough to read the temperature of a room at a glance. He returned to the anteroom, where the 3 temporary footmen from the village were waiting for instruction, and told them the evening was going well. The orchestra was from Bath, 4 musicians and a leader who had been playing assemblies and private balls since the century turned, and who had developed, over that long practice, an acute instinct for what a room required at any given hour. At 10:30 he called a waltz, a modern choice for a Somerset house, but not, he had judged from the quality of the evening, a misjudgment. The floor filled. Philip looked at Eulalia and she gave him her hand for the second time that night. And they went out onto the floor together. The waltz required a proximity that the country dances permitted only briefly and at intervals. And she felt in the quality of his hold, his right hand at her back, firm without pressure, the specific care of someone who does not wish to grip what he does not want to lose. The difference between the man who had led her onto the floor at the Harkness ball in January and the man who held her now. Something had been completed. Something that had been moving since the night of her father's dinner, through the grey February garden and the East Passage corridor and the cold months of the estate's incremental thaw, had arrived at its form. He danced well, with the economy of someone who learned young and has never needed to think about it since. He said nothing through the first half of the figure. Then, in the interval of the second movement, he said, quietly, in the voice he used when the room around him had ceased to be relevant, "I meant what I said upstairs. I want you to understand precisely what I meant. Not as a convenience, not as a safe arrangement. Entirely." She looked at him. She could feel the steady beat of his hand at her back, the small adjustments of his lead through the figure, the particular discipline of a body doing one thing and thinking another. She thought of the night he had told her about Edmund, in a February garden against a wall of bare canes. She thought of the single winter rose, already gone to pressed paper in the back of her own writing table drawer. She thought of the years she had spent at the edge of rooms, in the corner where the lamplight did not reach, sure she was peripheral to the occasion, and that the occasion was not wrong. "Since the dinner at my father's table," she said. "Since you asked my name at the door a second time, and I did not understand yet why." She held his gaze steadily, the way she held everything that mattered. "That is when it started for me. I love you. I should have said it a long while ago." He did not answer in words. He drew her, very slightly, fractionally closer, through the next figure. And she felt the shift of it, the distance abbreviated by the exact amount that crossed the line from correct to deliberate. And they finished the waltz without speaking again. And it was, she thought, the most complete conversation she had ever had. The last carriage left the drive at 2 a.m. Eulalia stood at the open front door, with the August night coming in, warm still. The park dark and smelling of damp grass, and the last cut of the summer hay from the south field. The sky thick with stars, in the way that only late August produces. profligate and indifferent to the small lit square of a doorway beneath them. Philip stood beside her. Thomas and his footman were moving through the ballroom behind them, beginning the systematic erasure of the evening, the extinguished sconces, the collected glasses, the linen folded from the supper tables. In an hour, the house would be returned to itself. Lavinia came to say good night. She put her small hand briefly against Eulalia's cheek, a gesture she had never made before, and which she performed with the contained certainty of a woman who has decided that the moment warrants it and intends to waste no portion of it on sentiment. She looked at her son. She said good night to both of them and went upstairs. And that was all. And it was enough. The rooks were asleep in the elms. Somewhere in the park, a fox barked once, sharp and provisional, and was answered by silence. Edmund Philip George Pendrith was born in March, 14 months after the ball, in the south-facing bedroom above the walled garden, where the winter light came in longest. He arrived in the early morning with his father's amber eyes, the colour unmistakable even in the grey dawn light. The same mineral quality that caught the light and considered before returning it. And his mother's habit of regarding the world around him with a composure that asked nothing of it before it had been properly examined. Eulalia asked on the third morning, when Philip came to sit beside the bed and she had laid the child in his arms for the first time and watched him hold the small weight with the careful exactness of a man who has not held a child before and is determined to do it correctly. She asked if they might call him Edmund. Philip was quiet for a long time. The baby opened his amber eyes at the ceiling with the serene incuriosity of the very new. Philip looked at him. Then he handed the child back to her, stood up, and left the room. She did not call after him. She sat with the child against her shoulder and waited, the way she had always waited, present, unhurried, making no requirement of the silence. He was back within 20 minutes. His eyes, when he came through the door, were wet. Not weeping, past weeping. The kind of wet eyes a man has when the feeling has moved through him and left its mark. He sat down again. He looked at the child for a long moment. Edmund, he said. The name in his voice had a different quality than it had ever had before. Not the private quality of grief's name for loss, but something that could be said aloud in a lit room. He said it again, quietly, to the child. Edmund. The blue leather miniature case from the writing desk in the east room now sat on the mantelpiece in the first-floor corridor, opposite the south window, moved there by Philip some weeks after the unlocking of the door, without announcement, in the way that objects find their right positions in a house when the house is ready for them. It caught the morning light from the window opposite, the hinge worn smooth from handling over many years, and it was the first thing Edmund would eventually be tall enough to ask about, pointing with one small finger at the painted face, and Philip would stand beside him and answer. The great table in the dining room still ran its full length, 22 feet of polished mahogany, the same deep grain, the same quality of surface that showed you back to yourself slightly elongated in the dark. It had not been shortened. The wood was too old and too fine for alteration, and in any case, the length had its own truth. For formal evenings, all 20 places were set in their correct order, the silver placed with Thomas's particular exactness, the arrangement as it had been in the old Duke's time. For ordinary evenings, and there were a great many ordinary evenings, autumn and winter and the long spring, the evenings that constituted the actual substance of a life, rather than its occasions, Thomas laid 2 places at the near end, close enough to pass the salt without reaching, close enough for conversation to remain what it was, rather than become announcement. The long, empty mahogany stretched away behind them into the room's farther dark, and neither of them remarked on it, because it had long since become simply the condition of their table. This inhabited near end, and beyond it, the unclaimed length of all the years before. On an evening in late November, a single candle burned between the two places. The fire had burned down behind the grate, and the room had settled into the specific quality of stillness that comes when a house has done its day's work and is resting inside its own warmth. The candle flame stood straight in the windless air, not guttering, not straining, burning with the steady patience of a thing that has been properly made and is doing what it was made to do. The light it threw reached the two plates, the two glasses, the near grain of the mahogany, and stopped. Beyond it, the long table faded into the room's shadow, quiet and unhurried, holding its dark.